The wind came down from the mountains like a grief-stricken thing, whipping dust into small, swirling devils that danced across the desolate plain. It found Thomas Calloway on his porch, a man etched by loss and weathered like the ancient rocks that guarded the horizon. Years had carved lines around his eyes and pulled his mouth into a permanent, weary set. The sun dipped low, bleeding orange and purple across the sky, a spectacle Thomas barely noticed anymore. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his land, the rhythm of chores, and the vast, echoing silence where his wife, Sarah, and their infant son had once filled the air with life. Grief was a physical weight, a stone he carried in his chest, crushing the air from his lungs and the light from his eyes. He had built the ranch with Sarah, dreaming of a future etched into the unforgiving soil. Her death during childbirth, and the babies soon after, had shattered that future into a million shards of pain. He hadn't bothered picking them up. He simply existed, moving through the days, a ghost haunting the life he was supposed to have lived. He rarely went into town anymore. The small cluster of wooden buildings huddled by the train tracks felt alien, filled with faces that held pity he didn't want or curiosity he couldn't bear. The general storekeeper, Mr. Davies, understood well enough to just nod and get the supplies ready. Anything else was too much. The land was his solace and his prison. The vastness swallowed his shouts, the wind carried away his tears if any dared fall, and the endless sky offered no judgment, only indifference. This evening, though, necessity had driven him out. A part on the windmill had snapped, and without it, drawing water was back-breaking labor he was too tired for. He rode into Willow Creek as the last rays of sun bled into twilight. The train station, usually a hub of noise and brief, transient life, was quiet. The afternoon train had long since passed, leaving behind the settling dust and the smell of coal smoke. He tied his horse Dusty to the post and cast a quick, practiced glance around. That's when he saw her. She was huddled on the wooden bench outside the station house, a small, still figure swallowed by the looming shadow of the building. The wind bit at her thin clothes. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the deep shade of her skin, the dark, straight hair tangled around a face too young to hold such emptiness. An Apache girl, alone, freezing. A knot tightened in his gut. Prejudice ran deep in Willow Creek. Any native face was met with suspicion, fear, or outright hostility. An Apache, particularly, stirred old resentments and whispered fears born of conflict and misunderstanding. For her to be sitting here, exposed, meant something had gone terribly wrong. He hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to ride on, get his part, and retreat to the safety of his isolation. This wasn't his problem. Getting involved meant trouble, the kind he had spent years avoiding. It meant stepping back into the messy, unpredictable world of people, a world that had only ever brought him pain. But the wind, howling around the corners of the station, seemed to carry the ghosts of his own losses, whispering of cold earth and final stillness. He remembered holding his son's tiny, lifeless hand, feeling the rapid ebb of warmth. He remembered Sarah's pale face, her eyes wide with fear and pain before they closed forever. This girl on the bench, alone against the biting cold, looked like a piece of that same vulnerable, fragile humanity the world seemed so eager to crush. He walked towards her. His boots sounded loud on the wooden platform. She flinched but didn't look up. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her knees, her head tucked down. She wore a simple, worn dress and a thin shawl that offered little protection against the wind's icy teeth. He stopped a few feet away. "Girl," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She finally raised her head, her eyes wide and dark in her narrow face. Fear flickered there, deep and raw. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, ready to bolt or bite. She didn't speak. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, stating the obvious. "It's getting cold." Still no answer. Her gaze darted around, as if searching for escape routes, or perhaps for someone who wasn't coming. Her lips were chapped and blue. "Where's your people?" he asked, feeling awkward. A faint tremor ran through her body. She hugged herself tighter. He sighed, the sound lost in the wind. He wasn't equipped for this. He wasn't equipped for anything beyond the silent routine of his ranch. But he couldn't just leave her. The image of his son, small and cold, was too potent. "You got somewhere to go?" he tried again. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, the stubble rough. The town was no place for her, not like this, alone and exposed. The sheriff, Mr. Brody, was no friend to natives. The women, like Martha Higgins with her sharp tongue and narrow eyes, would see her as nothing but a threat or a nuisance. He looked at the girl, then at the empty tracks stretching into the bruised twilight. He made a decision, swift and unexpected, even to himself. It was born of a deep, aching empathy he hadn't known he still possessed, a fragile ember rekindled by the sight of her vulnerability. "All right," he said, his voice firm now. "You come with me. My place ain't much, but it's warm. You can figure things out from there." Her eyes widened further, searching his face. Suspicion warred with desperate need. She didn't move. He took a step closer, holding out a hand, palm up, a gesture of peace. "Thomas Calloway," he said, offering his name, a thing he rarely shared. "I won't hurt you." After a long moment, she slowly, tentatively, extended a hand. It was small and cold. He took it gently, helping her stand. She swayed slightly, stiff with cold and fear. He didn't let go immediately, offering a moment of steady contact. Her skin was surprisingly soft against his calloused palm. He led her to Dusty, helped her mount, then climbed up behind her, wrapping a spare blanket he kept tied behind the saddle around her small frame. She was rigid against him, a trembling bundle of bone and fear. As they rode out of town, a few figures emerged from the saloon and the general store. They stopped, pointing, their murmurs carried on the wind. Thomas ignored them. He felt their eyes on his back, felt the weight of their judgment settling over him like the dust. He knew this act, taking in an Apache girl, especially him, the reclusive widower, would shock the town. It would stir gossip, suspicion, maybe even anger. But as he held the trembling girl against him, urging Dusty towards the lonely dark of his ranch, he found he didn't care. For the first time in years, the stone in his chest shifted, replaced by a different, unfamiliar weight, responsibility. They rode in silence under a sky now thick with stars. The cold deepened. The girl eventually relaxed a fraction against him, the warmth of the blanket and his body a small comfort against the biting wind. When they reached the ranch, the cabin was dark and silent. He dismounted stiffly, then lifted her down. She stood awkwardly, looking around at the unfamiliar place, the corrals, the barn, the small, dark cabin. "Come on," he said, leading her towards the cabin door. He fumbled with the latch, his hands stiff. Inside, it was cold and smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. He lit a lamp, the sudden light making her squint. He saw her properly then. Young, maybe 14 or 15, thin, with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass and eyes that held the wisdom of ages and the terror of a child. There was a cut above her eyebrow, clotted with dried blood, and a bruise blooming on her cheek. "Sit by the fire," he instructed, gesturing towards the hearth. He moved to build a fire quickly, his movements efficient and practiced. Kindling larger pieces, strike a match. Soon, flames licked at the wood, casting a warm, flickering glow. She settled near the fire, still huddled in the blanket. He busied himself, avoiding her gaze. He poured water from the basin, heated it on the small stove, found a clean rag. He knelt before her, the lamp between them. "Let me clean that," he said, indicating the cut. She flinched away slightly, but didn't resist. He was gentle, dabbing at the wound, cleaning away the dry blood. She watched him with those two knowing eyes. "My name is Nahili," she said, her voice a soft murmur, the first words he'd heard her speak. He paused, meeting her gaze. "Nahili," he repeated, testing the sound. It felt strange, speaking a name that wasn't Sarah or his son's. "Thomas." He finished cleaning the cut, then found a bit of clean cloth to cover it. He stood up, feeling the years of stiffness in his joints. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded, a small, hesitant movement. He had meager supplies: beans, salt pork, coffee, dry biscuits. He set about heating some beans and frying a small piece of pork. The sounds of cooking filled the quiet cabin, a domestic rhythm long absent. She watched him the whole time, a silent, observant presence. He dished up the food onto 2 tin plates and set one before her on the small, scarred table. She ate slowly, carefully, as if unsure when she might eat again. He ate his own meal, the silence punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the scrape of forks on tin. It wasn't comfortable silence, Not yet, but it wasn't the suffocating silence he was used to. It was a shared silence, fragile and tentative. When she finished, she pushed the plate away and looked at the fire. "Where are your people, Nahili?" he asked again gently. Her gaze turned distant. "Gone," she whispered, the single word heavy with unspoken tragedy. "Soldiers, sickness." She trailed off, her shoulders slumping. A cold dread settled over him. He understood. Many tribes had been decimated by disease, conflict, the relentless push of settlers. She was likely an orphan, cast adrift. You were at the station. Were you waiting for someone?" She shook her head. "Trying to get to San Carlos," she murmured, naming the Apache reservation. "My aunt, maybe." San Carlos was a long, dangerous way south. For a girl alone, it was almost impossible. The thought of her trying to make that journey on her own made his gut clench. "How did you get to Willow Creek?" "Road, on a wagon, with a family, going west," she said, speaking in short bursts. "They stopped, in town, said they couldn't take me farther, left me." Left her, like a forgotten package. He felt a surge of quiet anger towards the faceless family. "You must be tired," he said, standing up. "Got a cot in the corner. Not much, but it's clean." He pointed to a narrow cot against the wall, piled with saddle blankets and a rough woolen one. It wasn't the feather mattress Sarah had loved, but it was shelter. She nodded, stood up, and moved towards the cot, still clutching the blanket he'd given her. She lay down, facing the wall, pulling the blankets tight around her. Thomas extinguished the lamp, leaving only the fire's glow. He went to his own bed, a straw mattress on a wooden frame. Sleep didn't come easily. The cabin felt different with another person in it, a presence that filled the empty spaces. He listened to her quiet, steady breathing and the wind outside. He wondered what the morning would bring, what he had gotten himself into. The next few days were a dance of cautious proximity. Nahili was quiet, observant. She spoke only when necessary, her answers brief. Thomas didn't press her. He showed her where things were, the well, the small outhouse, the woodpile. He went about his chores, mending fences, feeding the horses and cattle, working on the windmill part. She started helping, tentatively at first. She gathered kindling without being asked, helped wash the few dishes, swept the cabin floor with a broom made of twigs. She moved with a quiet grace, her presence like a soft shadow. He noticed the small things, how she carefully folded the blanket each morning, the way she watched the horses with a stillness that bordered on reverence, the quiet gratitude in her eyes when he offered her a piece of dried apple. He began talking to her more, not expecting answers, just filling the silence. He talked about the land, the changing seasons, the stubbornness of the cattle, the unpredictable nature of the weather. He told her about building the cabin, about Sarah's small garden, about the hopes they had held for this place. He spoke of his wife and son in a way he hadn't in years, the words coming out haltingly at first, then with a slow, steady flow. He didn't look at Nahili as he spoke, focusing on the fire or the view out the window, but he felt her presence, her quiet attention. It was like talking to the wind, but a wind that listened. One evening, while the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, he was whittling a piece of wood by the fire. Nahili watched him. "You make pretty things," she said, her voice still soft but losing some of its earlier fear. He stopped, looking at the simple bird he was carving. "Just past the time," he mumbled. He hadn't carved since Sarah was alive. She had loved the little wooden animals he made. "My grandmother, she told stories with wood," Nahili said. "Figures, animals, they would dance." He looked at her, a spark of interest in his weary eyes. "Tell me," he said. She hesitated, then slowly began, describing the figures her grandmother carved, the stories they represented, tales of creation, of animals, of the spirits of the land. Her voice gained strength as she spoke, her hands moving slightly as if shaping the air. He listened, captivated. It was a glimpse into a world utterly foreign to him, a world rich with tradition and meaning. It was the first time he had heard her speak at length, the first time he saw something beyond the fear and loss in her eyes, a flicker of pride, a connection to her past. He finished the small bird carving and, on impulse, held it out to her. "For you," he said. She took it gently, turning it in her hands. A faint smile touched her lips, transforming her face. It was like watching the sun break through clouds. "Thank you," she whispered. She held the bird carefully, reverently. Something shifted between them then. The wall of silence and suspicion didn't crumble entirely, but a door creaked open. They were no longer just a lonely man and a frightened girl sharing a roof out of necessity. They were two people, wounded by loss, finding a fragile connection in the vast, indifferent world. The town, of course, did not remain indifferent. News traveled fast, carried on the same wind that swept the dust. Thomas knew they were talking. He saw it in the way people stopped speaking when he entered the general store, the way eyes followed him. A week after he brought Nahili home, Mr. Brody, the sheriff, rode out to the ranch. He was a big man, his face jowly and set in a perpetual scowl. Martha Higgins, a widow known for her piety and sharp tongue, was with him, perched awkwardly side-saddle on a mare, her lips pursed. Thomas met them outside the cabin. Nahili stayed inside, visible through the window, watching with wide, fearful eyes. "Calloway," Brody said, his voice flat and official. "Heard you got a visitor." "She's not a visitor," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "She's staying here." Martha sniffed, drawing her shawl tighter around her. "An Apache, Thomas? In your home?" Her tone dripped with disapproval and thinly veiled fear. "It ain't right. It ain't safe." "She was freezing at the station, Martha," Thomas said, looking at her directly. "Alone. No one else did anything." "She's a wild creature," Brody cut in, resting a hand on the butt of his gun. "They cause trouble, could be dangerous." "She's a girl," Thomas countered, his voice tightening. "Lost, like a stray dog. You'd kick a dog out in the cold?" Brody's face darkened. "Don't compare her to a dog, Calloway. She's one of them. They ain't like us." "What are you suggesting, Sheriff?" Thomas asked, keeping his gaze steady. "Suggesting she belongs with her own kind," Brody said. "Suggesting you bring her back to town. We can figure out what to do with her." "Figure out what?" Thomas asked. "Send her to the reservation? Alone? It's a long way, Brody, full of dangers." "That's not your concern," Martha said, her voice shrill. "Your concern is the safety of the good people of Willow Creek. Having her here, it could invite others, raiders." Thomas almost laughed. "Raiders? Martha, she's a girl who barely comes up to my shoulder. What's she gonna raid? My bean supply?" His attempt at levity fell flat. Brody straightened. "This isn't a joke, Calloway. People are worried. They want her gone. Either you bring her in peaceful, or I might have to come get her." The implied threat hung in the air. Thomas felt the familiar clench of fear, the desire to retreat, to avoid conflict. But then he thought of Nahili inside, her small, vulnerable presence, the trust she was starting to place in him, the spark of life her stories had brought back into his dead world. He thought of the cold bench at the station, the indifference of the town. "She stays here," Thomas said, his voice low and hard, leaving no room for argument. "She's under my protection. You or anyone else wants her, you'll have to come through me." Brody stared at him, surprised by the steel in his voice. Thomas Calloway, the quiet, broken widower, was standing up to him. Martha looked horrified. "Thomas, have you lost your senses?" "My senses are just fine, Martha," Thomas said. "Now, I got work to do. This is my land. You ain't welcome here if you're coming to threaten me or the girl." Brody's hand tightened on his gun. For a moment, Thomas thought it might come to a shootout. He wasn't fast anymore, hadn't needed to be in years, but he knew how to handle a rifle. Brody held his gaze for a long moment, his eyes narrowed, the wind tugged at his hat. He seemed to be weighing the potential hassle, the risk of confronting a man defending his home against the demands of the fearful townspeople. Finally, he let go of his gun. "This ain't over, Calloway," he warned. "The town won't stand for it." "That's between the town and me then," Thomas replied. Brody grunted and turned his horse. Martha gave Thomas one last look of furious disapproval, then urged her mare to follow. Thomas watched them ride away, disappearing over the rise. He felt a tremor in his hands, a cold sweat on his back. He had drawn a line. He had invited trouble onto his doorstep, trouble far bigger than a broken windmill part. He went inside. Nahili was standing by the table, her face pale, her eyes fixed on him. "They want me to leave," she stated, not a question. "I know," he said. "You should let them take me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They will hurt you." He walked over to her, stopping in front of her. He knelt down so they were at eye level. "Nahili," he said, his voice gentle. "They won't hurt me, not as long as I'm standing, and I'm not letting them take you." He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else, relief, maybe even trust. "You called me by my name," she whispered. He hadn't even realized he had. "Yeah," he said, a small, unpracticed smile touching his lips. "You're Nahili, not the Apache girl, not a savage, you're Nahili." She reached out a hand and touched his arm, a brief, light touch. "Thank you, Thomas." The tension eased slightly in the cabin. They had faced the outside world together, and for now, they had held their ground. The bond between them, forged in silence and shared hardship, had been tested and strengthened. Life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. The external threat from the town simmered, but didn't immediately boil over. Brody seemed content to let Calloway stew for a while, perhaps hoping he'd change his mind, or that Nahili would simply disappear. But Nahili didn't disappear. She became a fixture, a quiet, integral part of the place. She continued to help with chores, her movements becoming more confident. She learned to feed the chickens, to milk the cow, to help patch fences. She was quick and capable, learning by watching. She didn't complain about the hard work or the isolation. It seemed she preferred the quiet solitude of the ranch to the hostile glare of the town. Their conversations grew longer, easier. He learned more about her life before, the beauty of her people's land, the richness of their traditions, the close bonds of family, the devastating loss that had scattered them like leaves in a storm. He told her more about Sarah, about their dreams, about the ache of losing them both. They shared their grief, two solitary islands finding refuge in each other's understanding. He taught her to ride Dusty properly, not just perched in front of him, but handling the reins herself. Her initial fear of the large animal gave way to a quiet confidence. He watched her ride across the pasture, her dark hair streaming in the wind, a sight that brought an unexpected ache to his chest. Not of sadness this time, but something akin to hope. Nahili, in turn, taught him things. She showed him how to find water even in dry creek beds, how to read the signs in the land that spoke of approaching weather or the presence of animals. She taught him the names of plants he had only seen as weeds, and which ones could be used for healing or food. She saw the world with different eyes, eyes that were deeply connected to the earth in a way he, despite years on the land, had never fully grasped. His understanding of his own home deepened, becoming richer, more alive. The stone in his chest didn't disappear, but its edges softened. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with their quiet presence, the shared rhythm of their lives. He still missed Sarah and his son with an ache that was part of his bones, but the pain was no longer all-consuming. There was room for other feelings, warmth, responsibility, a quiet affection for the resilient girl who had walked into his life and nudged him back towards the land of the living. But the town didn't forget. The simmering resentment occasionally boiled over. One afternoon, when Thomas went to town for supplies, he found the general store empty except for Mr. Davies, who avoided his eyes. "Brody's been talkin'," Davies mumbled, stacking cans on a shelf. "Folks are gettin' riled again." "Let them," Thomas said, his voice weary. "Martha's leadin' the charge," Davies continued in a low voice. "Sayin' it's a sin, havin' a heathen under your roof, sayin' you're asking for trouble." "Maybe I am," Thomas said, picking up his order. He paid Davies, their hands not quite touching. As he left the store, he saw Martha and a few other women gathered on the boardwalk, watching him. Their faces were hard, judgmental. He met their stares, his own gaze steady, and walked past without a word. He could feel the weight of their disapproval, but it felt less crushing than it once would have. He had something, someone, worth facing their judgment for now. The real trouble came with the spring thaw. A group of cattle rustlers had been working the territory, bolder now that winter was breaking. They weren't the type to shy away from violence. One evening, just before dusk, 3 of them rode up to the ranch. Thomas saw them coming across the plain, silhouetted against the setting sun. He felt the familiar prickle of fear, but it was different this time. It wasn't just fear for himself. "Nahili," he said, his voice sharp, "get inside. Lock the door, don't come out." She looked at him, her eyes wide. She didn't argue. She ran into the cabin. Thomas grabbed his rifle from the rack above the door. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wouldn't run either. He stood on the porch, the rifle held loosely but ready. The three men rode up, their faces rough and unfriendly. The one in the middle, a burly man with a scarred face, seemed to be the leader. "Heard you got some good stock, Calloway," the leader said, his voice a low growl. "They ain't for sale," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We weren't looking to buy," another man sneered. He glanced towards the cabin. "Heard you got something else interesting too, a little squaw?" Thomas's grip on the rifle tightened. "Get off my land," he said, his voice dangerously low. The leader chuckled, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Feisty, ain't you? The town thinks you're soft in the head for keeping her. We think you're just holding on to something we might enjoy." Nahili's face flashed in his mind, her quiet strength, her vulnerable eyes, her tentative smile. He remembered the cold bench, the indifferent town. He wouldn't let these men touch her. "Last chance," Thomas said. "Ride out." The leader exchanged a look with his men. "Don't think so, old man. We'll take the cattle, and then we'll see about the girl." The leader reached for his pistol. Thomas didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot echoed across the twilight-filled plain. The leader cried out, clutching his shoulder, his pistol dropping to the ground. The other two men reacted instantly, drawing their weapons. Thomas ducked behind the thick wooden support of the porch. Splinters flew as bullets thudded into the wood. He hadn't killed the man, but he had hit him hard enough to take him out of the fight for a moment. It was enough. He needed to scare the others off, not get into a prolonged gun battle he was sure to lose. He fired again, aiming high and wide, making the shot sound like a warning. "Get out," he yelled, "or the next one finds its mark." The rustlers hesitated. One glanced at his wounded leader, the other at the cabin, then back at the determined figure behind the porch post. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance from the quiet rancher. They were rustlers, not soldiers. This wasn't worth a potential gunfight to the death. "Let's go," one of them yelled, helping the wounded leader onto his horse. They turned and rode away, disappearing back the way they came, their forms swallowed by the deepening gloom. Thomas stayed behind the post for a long moment, listening, his heart hammering against his ribs. When the sound of their horses faded, he slowly lowered his rifle, his hands shaking violently now. He walked to the cabin door and unlocked it. Nahili was standing just inside, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Just shaken." He looked at her, really looked at her. In the dim light of the cabin, she seemed both fragile and incredibly strong. She had trusted him to protect her, and he had. "They're gone," he said. She nodded, relief flooding her face. Then, she did something unexpected. She walked towards him and, reaching up, put her arms around his waist, hugging him tightly. He was stiff for a moment, unused to physical closeness, unused to being held or needed in this way. Then, slowly, tentatively, he put his arms around her, holding her against him. She was small and trembling, but solid. It wasn't the embrace of a lover, or even a father and daughter. It was the embrace of two survivors, finding solace and safety in each other's presence after facing down a threat. It was a quiet, profound affirmation of their bond. "Thank you, Thomas," she murmured into his chest. "You're welcome, Nahili," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The attack seemed to be a turning point. When the rustlers returned to town, word spread about Calloway standing his ground, defending his ranch and the girl. It wasn't the story the townspeople expected. It challenged their narrative of the helpless widower and the dangerous savage. Sheriff Brody rode out again a few days later, but his demeanor was different. There was less bluster, more grudging respect. "Heard you ran off the rustlers," Brody said, staying on his horse this time. "They decided they didn't want what I had," Thomas said, standing unarmed on the porch, Nahili a silent presence just behind him in the doorway. Brody looked at Nahili, then back at Thomas. He didn't say anything about her this time. "They hit the Miller place next," he said instead. "Took 5 head. Thomas nodded. "Folks are still talkin'," Brody admitted, shifting in the saddle. "But, well, you did us all a favor running off them fellas." It wasn't an apology or an acceptance, but it was a shift. The town hadn't welcomed Nahili, and likely never truly would, but Calloway's act of defiance, his willingness to defend what was his, including the girl under his roof, had earned him a grudging respect, or at least a hesitant pause in their judgment. Life on the ranch continued, quieter now, but with a deeper foundation. Thomas and Nahili had faced external threats and internal ghosts, and they had found strength in each other. The ranch, once a monument to loss, was slowly, tentatively, becoming a home again, not the home he had dreamed of with Sarah, but a new home, built on resilience, unexpected connection, and the quiet courage to stand against prejudice. Nahili still sometimes spoke of San Carlos, of finding her aunt. Thomas knew that day might come, he wouldn't hold her back. But for now, she was here, and for now, that was enough. They had built a life, a shared space of peace and belonging in a world that had tried to deny them both. The spring turned into summer, the prairie blooming with wildflowers, splashes of color across the vast green. Thomas and Nahili rode Dusty out sometimes, just to watch the sun rise or set, two figures on horseback against the immense sky. He wasn't the man he had been, hardened and closed off by grief. He was still marked by it, always would be, but he was also open, capable of connection, capable of finding light in the darkness. Nahili was no longer the terrified, freezing girl on the station bench. She was a young woman, still quiet and watchful, but with a spark of life in her eyes, a sense of belonging that radiated from her. The prejudice of the town hadn't disappeared, but it felt distant, less potent than the bond they had forged on the lonely prairie. They had found each other at the edge of despair, one broken man and one lost girl. And in the quiet rhythms of the ranch, under the vast western sky, they had begun to heal, together, proving that sometimes the most profound connections are found in the most unexpected places. Emerging like a fragile bloom from the harshest ground, the cowboy who saw a freezing Apache girl at the train station hadn't just offered shelter, he had offered hope, and in doing so, had found his own. The town may have been shocked, but the prairie, ancient and wise, simply witnessed two souls finding their way home.